My name is Babak Rahimi. I'm the director of the program for the study of religion at UCSD. Before I introduce today's topic and also our esteemed presenters, let me first and foremost thank the Department of Anthropology, the Department of Literature, and also Thorough Studies, a program that I happen to also direct, for sponsoring today's event. Now, I mentioned Thorough Studies because I want to make sure that we underline that this event very much deals not just with the issue, of course, of climate change, but it's interrelated themes which relate to the idea of also social justice, inequality, economic inequality specifically, in which hopefully we could explore here as well. And Thorough Studies as a program also studies that as well as an academic program here on this campus. Now, just to introduce you the program for the study of religion, what the program does. This program is an interdisciplinary academic program that focuses on the study of religion as a set of discourses and social practices situated in historical contexts. The program is dedicated to pursue answers from a wide variety of perspectives, while at the same time recognizing religion as a historical category that has undergone various changes since the Christian Reformation. In light of its social formation, the program also understands religion as lived experience, that is, embodied forms of spirituality that are shaped and shape the everyday life. Speaking of the everyday, today's symposium on the climate change and religion is among a number of campus events that the program for the study of religion has organized during this academic year in an attempt to address key questions of our time, hopefully through the prism of everyday life. These events range from topics related to questions about migration, which will be the focus of next quarter, based on religious identity or religious themes and practices, to social justice and also racial identity. In our November 16th event on Shakespeare and religion, I'm advertising for our next event here. For example, we'll be looking at how Shakespeare's artistic and literary works overlap with the wake of religious reformation in Western Europe at a time when fundamental questions about doctrine, religious conformity, and biblical interpretations were intensely raised and debated. I mean, to this day, what Shakespeare's were grappling with, still there are questions that are being debated to this day in various different religious traditions, specifically Christianity. Just to let you know, you could find the program's events at UCSD's religion website. Please take a look at it. There are upcoming events. November 16th is the next one that is coming up. I encourage you to attend that. Now, today's event on climate change and religion is also meant to address a major global issue that we are all experiencing. Today, I hope, or we seek to really understand if religion has played a part or perhaps has a part to play in shaping our responses to climate change. In other words, to understand human responses to climate change, we need to also consider how religious institutions, traditions, and practices around the world perceive and respond to one of the most significant problems of our age. This is global warming, a phenomenon which most scientists agree is primarily caused by human behavior. With the view that climate change is a world phenomenon with most significant catastrophic consequences, we are therefore looking at how religions have and will respond, for example, to various different unfolding crises. The most important one I would suggest here is the refugee crisis, which, as the executive director of the Environment Justice Foundation, Steve Trent, has recently described as the most unpredictable ingredient that, when added to existing social, economic, and political tensions, has the potential to ignite violence and conflict with disastrous consequences. Now, it is in light of this major topic, very relevant to our lives, that I'm more than happy and delighted with lots of pleasure to introduce you to our today's speakers. Today we are privileged to have Professor Thomas Shorrosh here with us, and also Professor Karma Lekshe Somo. to give two presentations, and the presentations will follow by discussion by Professor Aftab Jasal, who will discuss what has been presented, and then eventually we'll open up to Q&A. Now, for our first speaker, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Shordash. He's a distinguished professor in the Department of Anthropology, the Dr. James Chan Presidential Chair in Global Health, founding director of the Global Health Program, and co-director of Global Health Institute at the University of California, San Diego. He has served as president of Society for Anthropology of Religion and co-editor Ethos, Journal of the Society for Psychological Anthropology, as an elected member of the American Society for the Study of Religion. His research interests include medical and psychological anthropology, global mental health, anthropological theory, comparative religion, cultural phenomenology and embodiment, globalization and social change, and also language and culture. He has conducted ethnographic research among charismatic Catholics, Navajo Indians, adolescent psychiatric patients in New Mexico, and Catholic exorcists in United States and Italy, spanning topics that include therapeutic process and religious healing, ritual language and creativity, sensory imagery, self-transformation, techniques of the body, casual reasoning about illness, and the experience of psychiatric patients. This is really interesting. Throughout his career, Professor Shordash has done innovative anthropological studies of embodied experience and how our experience is transformed through healing, illness, and language. May I ask for you to come up? Can we welcome the professor to today's panel? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Babak. It's a great pleasure to be here as part of the program for the study of religion and to be part of a panel with Lakshmi and Aftab. It's always, I think, very valuable when you're trying to understand a phenomenon to have something to compare it to. And that's one of the reasons why I think this is such a great panel, because we have two scholars coming from two very different backgrounds, disciplinary backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, etc. And I also, within my own talk, want to frame it in terms of a comparison. And the comparison will be between that of the Navajo, the Dene people, and the Roman Catholic religion. It's quite a substantial contrast. The Navajo are a distinct people in a particular place with a unique culture, while the Roman Catholic Church represents a global religion with a universal message. And I want to focus on two very interesting and important documents in this talk. The Navajo document is called Do Nashyeda, Considering the Logic of the Dene Natural Resource Protection Act of 2005 and the Desert Rock Power Plant Project. And the Catholic document is called Laudato Si, On Care for Our Common Home, by Pope Francis, the current Pope of the Catholic Church. These are different religions representing different ways of inhabiting the world. Well, what kind of world? How did the world come about that we inhabit? Very different story from the standpoint of the Navajo and the Catholics or Christians. In the Navajo way of thinking about the world and the universe and the environment, there were 4 successive worlds that existed, that succeeded one another, and that's the way things are. In the first world, the beings eventually squabbled and quarreled with one another to the point that they destroyed the world. And the people who survived, or the beings that survived, because there weren't really humans yet, kind of escaped out of a little hole into the second world. And they lived there for a while, and more developments happened. And those people quarreled among themselves, and they had to crawl out through a little hole into the third world. And the third world existed for a while, and more developments happened, but finally it too was destroyed by a great flood. And people had to climb up out of a little hole into the fourth world where we live now and where we try to survive. In the Christian way of thinking, and the Catholics' way of thinking, there was an actual creation event. There was a myth. The world was created in 7 days, and it came about. And it existed for a while, and then people started messing up, and there was a great flood. And Noah protected the people and the beings that existed and survived, and the world went on. So these are very different stories about a very different kind of universe that people inhabit, a very different kind of world, but there are some overlaps, right? The story of the Great Flood exists in both forms. So these are the comparisons that I would like to invoke. Now, the Navajo Nation is the largest Native American tribe that exists in the continent, and they have the largest land area that they possess. It's about, I've heard it said, it's about the same size as the state of West Virginia, or the same size as Belgium and the Netherlands combined. But it's a very arid and environmentally challenged area. And in particular, the Navajos have had to endure a great deal of environmental degradation on their own. For example, currently the area is becoming increasingly more arid. There's been a 20-year-long drought, and one of climate change's markers in this respect is the spread of sand dunes. The dunes in the southwestern corner of the reservation are advancing about 115 feet per year. And as it's reported in an article that I discovered describing this, although the water in the streams is gone for long periods, that water moved sand and silt along the stream bed when it was flowing. When the water dries up, the loose sediment is still in the dry stream bed. When the wind kicks up, it blows out across the areas downwind of that stream and begins to form new sand dunes. When rain does come, often in more intense storms, even more sediment flows downstream, increasing the size of the dunes. Sand dunes are normally stabilized by vegetation, but much of that vegetation has died amid the drought, allowing the dunes to spread, jeopardizing the rangeland and even homes. Some people in the southwest quadrant of the Navajo Nation may be forced to relocate because of the encroaching sand dunes. The sand dunes currently extend over about 1/3 of the 27,000 square mile reservation. During the 1996 to 2009 drought period, the extent of sand dunes fields increased by some 70%. The dunes are covering houses, burying cars, snarling traffic, degrading grazing and agricultural land, contributing to the loss of rare and endangered native plants, and when they occur, contributing to poor air quality, a serious health concern for many of the reservation's 175,000 inhabitants. Air quality, why? Because sandstorms. The wind is blowing the sand all over the place. Sometimes there's 30-foot tall sand dunes. So Navajo land is experiencing global warming and climate change in a way that's a very big challenge. In fact, Navajo land is a place where a lot of the problems come together. Poverty is rampant, 47% unemployment. Drought, as we've mentioned, for the last 20 years. Desertification via sand dunes. Coal mines polluting the land and the water and the air with the dust that blows around. And before that, it was uranium mining and contamination of the land with piles of uranium tailings from mines. There are now huge coal power plants, some of the largest ones in the country, that are polluting this land that's regarded as sacred by the Navajo. Traditional religion and knowledge that emphasizes harmony is being challenged by this. Traditional healers have preserved Navajo ceremonies to a certain extent, but traditional medicinal plants and herbs, also considered sacred, are disappearing because of prolonged drought. In 2013, the National Climate Assessment referred to the Southwest as among the most climate-challenged regions in North America. Because of the close spiritual and cosmological connections with the land defined by the Navajos' 4 sacred mountains, there's not only economic and psychological stress associated with climate change, but also a profound existential stress. This document that I showed you a bit ago is a remarkable one because it's based on the 2005 Navajo Nation Council law prohibiting uranium mining. It's called the Diné Natural Resources Protection Act of 2005. And Diné is the Navajo language word for Navajo. The act by the Navajo Nation government is based on what were called the fundamental laws of the Diné. This is a contemporary formulation of what was taken to be the wisdom of traditional Navajo religion. Actually, Navajo don't have a word for religion per se, though they do have one for ritual and ceremony. The document is entitled and based on the principle of Do Nash Ieda, loosely translated to mean things from within the earth that are known to be harmful to people should not be disturbed. The politics of the report, written by Andrew Curley of the Diné College Diné Policy Institute, was that the principles followed in adopting the law were not being followed in the tribal government's support of a newly proposed power plant called the Desert Rock Power Plant in 2008. The document argues that, and I quote, concern for overall global health must also be weighed in conjunction with Diné principles and logic when assessing future resource development on the Navajo Nation. Let me read just a couple of brief excerpts of how traditional Navajo language, spirituality, and religion is incorporated in this very contemporary document, which is a challenge to the proposal of this new power plant, based not only on traditional knowledge, but based on traditional knowledge as it's been legally incorporated in the legal code of the Navajo Nation. And you can see here how contemporary ecological thinking links up with traditional Navajo spirituality. The word sustainable in ecological terms means to keep natural elements in a state of balance. And in this sense, it is a very Navajo concept, and this act is accurate, the legal act is accurate, in claiming that sustainability is rooted in tradition. When taking in consideration with hojo, it's a Navajo word, the idea of balance, or a condition where everything is in its proper place and functioning in a harmonious relationship to and with everything else, it is compatible with historic Navajo understanding of environment. And when one considers the principle of ke'e, in which Navajo responsibilities to self, relatives, and environment are established, this balance works in a synergistic manner with living elements interdependent on one another and maintaining a natural hierarchy. And elsewhere, the document says that the natural law mandates that the Navajo must respect, honor, and protect the 4 sacred elements of life: air, light or fire, water, and earth or pollen. Pollen referring to corn pollen, which is the symbol of Navajo life and viability in the universe, because pollen is the wellspring of future life. More to the point, Navajos have sacred obligation and duty to respect, preserve, and protect all that was provided for them, and who were designated as the steward for these relatives. And the use of land, natural resources, sacred sites, and other living beings must be mitigated with proper protocols of respect and offering, and these practices must be protected and preserved, for they are the foundation of Navajo spiritual ceremonies and the Diné way of life. Therefore, we can conclude that the proposed desert rock power plant will destabilize harmony and balance in these dimensions, and conversely will not enhance these qualities. Now, I find this quite remarkable because it is a way of inhabiting the world that is a sacred world defined in mythological terms, but intensely engaged in contemporary life and conditions, fully aware of environmental degradation, fully aware of climate change, and fully aware of the challenges posed to the Navajo Nation by developments such as coal-fired power plants. Dwayne Champagne of the UCLA Center for American Indian Studies has written that tribal knowledge is made up of ceremonial interpretations and human experiences. So I think this is very nice because it does not allow us to think of traditional knowledge as simply something that's enshrined in stories and myths, not only the creation myth, but also in the way those myths are enacted in ceremonies, sacred actions, but also how they grow out of, how they organically develop from human experience. Okay. Catholicism. Catholicism is a global religion, a totally different scope when the Pope speaks in the kind of document that I held up for you a moment ago. This kind of document is called an encyclical, which basically is a letter from the Pope. And when the Pope writes an encyclical, he writes in a way that is expected to be attended to, and in fact is attended to not only by Catholics, but by people across a wide variety of traditions. Pope Francis recently published this encyclical called Laudato Si', which in Latin means "Praise be to you," and subtitled "On Care for Our Common Home." The encyclical combines religion and science in a very interesting way, beginning with an invocation of St. Francis of Assisi, who addressed Brother Sun and Sister Moon, and who also referred to our sister Mother Earth. And the encyclical ends with an invocation of the Eucharist and the Virgin Mary. All the footnotes are to other popes' encyclicals, statements by groups of bishops, or the Catholic Catechism, except, interestingly, a citation to one secular author and to one Sufi author. Yet we know that there is a lot of science in there because our own UC San Diego professor Veerabhadran Ramanathan of the Scripps Institution for Oceanography was personally involved with advising the Pope, and the Pope constantly refers to scientific evidence within his encyclical. In the encyclical, the Pope proposes and elaborates what he calls an integral ecology. The term integral has a special meaning in Catholic thinking, which I can't elaborate here, but we can say that it amounts, the notion of integral ecology, to a theory of nature and society. It's not only about the environment, but the environment, nature, and society are integrally related to one another. The Pope says, Earth, as our, quote, as our sister cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. He cites the, and I quote, symptoms which point to what is wrong, such as environmental degradation, anxiety, a loss of the purpose of life and of community living. He links the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. He mentions extreme weather events and social unrest in the same paragraph. And he cites his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, who wrote, "The external desert in the world is growing because the internal deserts have become so vast." The Pope links environment, culture, and daily life under the concept of the common good, articulated in the Constitution produced by the Second Vatican Council in the mid-1960s. Environment, economy, and the social are all related for him. Culture is threatened in terms of history, identity, architecture, and the viability of indigenous peoples. Kind of looping back to our discussion of the Navajo. Daily life is at issue with respect to civic space, overcrowding, poverty, housing, transportation, and what the Pope terms bodily morality, by which he means sexuality and sexual identity. Now, he's the Pope, he's going to get that kind of stuff in there. He blames what he calls the technocratic paradigm and compulsive consumerism as promoting these problems. Interestingly, the encyclical Laudato Si has had a pragmatic influence on what's been called the green religious movement. In May of 2017, 9 Catholic organizations announced plans to divest from their investments in fossil fuel corporations. So it actually does move the world a bit when an encyclical is promulgated. Okay, so we've talked about the Navajo and we've talked about the Catholics. Let's take a few minutes in concluding to compare the approaches. There are some striking parallels. Over and over in Navajo thinking, and over in the encyclical Laudato Si, you find reference to the word harmony. Over and over in Navajo thinking, and over again in the encyclical, you find reference to dignity. And a third prominent concept that is relevant here is the concept of nature. I'm going to say a little bit about the three of these to point out that the ideas of harmony and dignity are pretty parallel, but that there are some significant differences when it comes to the notion of nature. So let's talk about harmony. In Navajo thought and the Navajo language, there's a very prominent, maybe the most prominent concept in all of Navajo thinking is hojo. And hojo means beauty, it means harmony, it means balance, it means the expected ideal state of existence. And the opposite of hojo is hochon. You can tell just by the sounds of the words, right? The onomatopoetic sounds of the words that hojo and hochon are opposites, because hochon is evil and discord and disharmony. This fundamental polarity is what is being invoked and what was invoked in the document about the Desert Rock Power Plant. The idea that hojo, that includes the responsibility of humans to maintain through their everyday actions and through their ceremonial actions the state of hojo in the world, is being challenged. In the encyclical, you see also a reference to harmony in terms of the grandeur and beauty as part of a smoothly functioning Trinitarian nature. We're talking about the Christian Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, which are translated as the source of being, the creation and incarnation of the material world itself, and the bond of love. So the source is the Father, creation and incarnation is the Son, and the Holy Spirit is the bond of love. And the beauty of this is, I would propose, relatively in synchrony and parallel to the beauty that's defined as hojo in Navajo thinking. Dignity for the Navajo is expressed and was expressed in the document that I quoted in terms of the concept of eh. It's just K apostrophe E. And the apostrophe stands for that kind of glottal stop. Eh. It means kinship, respect for our family, taking care of our family. It means kinship among humans, but also kinship with the universe. For the Catholics and the Catholic way of thinking, dignity is understanding ourselves as part of divine creation, where creation is kind of expressed as an equation, at least by the Pope in his encyclical. Creation equals nature plus value. That's kind of the way he expresses it. Okay. So there's this parallel of harmony and dignity in the Navajo and Catholic ways of thinking. Okay. But what about nature? Nature is a very European Enlightenment kind of concept, and it exists in contrast with culture. Right? Navajo don't have a concept of nature any more than they have a concept of religion. That kind of distinction is not relevant because everything is part of the same existence. There's no nature apart from humanity, apart from thought, apart from beauty. So a unitary nature is part of the harmony and balance that's expressed by the concept of Hojong. The Navajo deities themselves, the Navajo holy people in traditional religion, are coterminous with aspects of the environment. There are 4 sacred mountains that define Dinebikeya, which means the Navajo's land. But these 4 sacred mountains don't just mark a boundary. There's no boundaries, there's just these landmarks. And not only are there these landmarks, but the Navajo mountains are persons in themselves. People of various kind, including humans, live in this world. There's no great emphasis on it having been created or that there's a purpose for its existence, but the emphasis is on the importance of harmony or balance, Hojong, and dignity or kinship. This balance of existence can be violated by personal abuses, and these are, if you look at old anthropological studies, these are referred to as violation of taboos, right? Taboos about the way the natural world, or falling into the use of nature, the world should be balanced and could be based on ignorance, which is why those who are trying to preserve Navajo culture these days pay so much attention to education in traditional ways. Teaching people about the stories, about the ceremonies, about the kinship system is so important. And of course, this kind of balance of the world can also be destroyed by industrial exploitation, by mining, by overgrazing, by abuses of the environment. Right? So nature in the European Catholic Christian way is slightly different because the world is the result of divine creation. But the Pope makes this point in a very interesting way, mostly in the context of kind of grounding his argument in a way that's receptive to science. The Pope says that nature has been demythologized, which in one sense renders the landscape spiritually neutral. Right? It's just neutral. It's stuff, things. Interestingly enough, from the religious standpoint, whereas the Navajo universe is always alive and charged with spiritual being, like the mountains are persons, everything is a being. because the Catholic world and the Western world has been demythologized, it allows for it to be all the more powerful when there's an apparition, when there's an eruption of the sacred or a hierophany. So you have this possibility of the apparitions of the Virgin Mary, and they're made that much more powerful because the landscape itself is demythologized. It's not sacred, it's just neutral. So when the sacred appears, boom, in a grotto or a stream, it's that much more powerful. However, demythologization also allows the earth to be exploited, because instead of a dominion, as it's used in the Bible, instead of a dominion with responsible stewardship, there can be domination with irresponsible anthropocentrism. So the Pope, in his approach to nature, ends with an invocation of the Eucharist. Very interesting. The Eucharist is communion that Catholics take when they go to Mass, and the idea is that it is an incarnation of the divine nature of Jesus into the material world in the form of bread. It's a sacrament, and the idea of a sacrament, as it was defined through the studies of the anthropologist R.R. Merritt, is precisely the consecration of a natural function, a rendering sacred of a natural function, taking something natural like eating and turning it into the body and blood of Christ. So this sacramental re-rendering of the environment or a human natural function as sacred, in a way, I think, takes us full circle back to the spiritually existential engagement with the world. And as different as the Navajo and Catholic views of the world are, I think that there are some very important similarities that are highly relevant to our understanding of the relationship between climate change and religion, the environment and religion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shordash. Our next speaker, Professor Carmen Somo, is a specialist in Buddhist studies and has taught at the University of San Diego since 2000. She offers classes in Buddhist thought and culture, world religions, comparative religious ethics, religious and political identities in the global community, and negotiating religious diversity in India. Her research interests include women in Buddhism, death and dying, Buddhist feminist ethics, Buddhism and bioethics, religion and politics, Buddhist social ethics, and Buddhist transnationalism. She integrates scholarship and social activism through the Sakyadhita International Association of Buddhist Women and Jamyang Foundation, an innovative education project for women in developing countries with 15 schools in the Indian Himalayas, Bangladesh, and Laos. Professor, can I have you? Please join me in welcoming Professor to UCSD.
Okay, namaste, tashtele, and welcome to this forum. I'm very happy to see that we're taking up a very important topic, essential to us all, because we live today in a fairly toxic environment. I'm not just talking politics, we're talking the earth itself. So in the 20th century, it's a great irony that amidst great prosperity, we're also seeing some of the greatest suffering that's ever occurred on planet Earth. Polluted minds, polluted Earth. So, of course, from a Buddhist worldview, this is not the only planet. We all know this is a medium-sized, planet and swirling around a medium-sized sun in a medium-sized galaxy, and the Buddhists knew that too. Many different world systems, infinite world systems, in fact, from a Buddhist perspective. The Buddhists bring a myriad useful sorts of practical perspectives on this issue. So I'd like to present a few of them to you today. We could begin by saying that the Buddhists have been concerned about the natural environment from the very beginning. After all, the Buddha was born under a tree, he got enlightened under a tree, he died under a tree. So the great outdoors was sort of where people lived at that time. And so that's naturally incorporated into the worldview, the Buddhist worldview. There was also a valuing of some simplicity. The monastic model of the simple lifestyle, so 3 robes and a bowl, was very environmentally friendly. So you basically have a very simple lifestyle that serves as a model, not only for the monastic community, but also for the lay community. So resources were treated with great respect, and people tried to tread lightly on the earth. The Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, that distress is part of the deal, part of being a sentient being, a human being or any kind of sentient being, but that this kind of distress has causes. So they would always try to trace back the causes. The third noble truth that this distress can have an end, and then there's a path, there's an actual roadmap to how to get to the point where we can relieve that kind of distress. So this distress is rooted in desire and ignorance, and desires are constant craving, clinging, and attachment to things, to the bling, but also attachment to ourselves is part of the problem. We're never satisfied. So human desires are endless. And this is something, if we recognize it, then we can do something about it. So the Buddha was pretty frank in pointing this out. The Buddha's goal, of course, is freedom from this kind of constant craving, desire, attachment, and so forth, which brings a kind of peace, not only in the future, but moment to moment, actually. So in order to do this, you recognize that things are impermanent. All of the problems that we face will eventually pass. But since life itself is impermanent, the Buddha advised us to make the most of it. Oh, okay, let's skip a slide. See if it'll go back. Okay, so the valuing of the human life, the precious human rebirth, trying to make the most of this precious opportunity, moment to moment. Because human life doesn't come frequently. It's rather rare in the endless scope of things. And the Buddhist sense of time, which they inherited from South Asian traditions, is infinite, right? We're just a small blip in an infinite time span. Now, in this worldview, sentient life is privileged. But the natural environment, of course, is essential for life to exist. So they talk about sentient beings as anything that has consciousness. And of course, it's conscious beings then that are able to evolve toward awakened consciousness. Without a consciousness, you can't awaken that consciousness. So carrots and cauliflowers are not going to become fully awakened, but they're useful for sentient life to become fully awakened. So in this view then, all sentient beings have the potential to become liberated, or even eventually fully awakened, according to the Mahayana school. sentient beings revolve continually in a cycle of birth and death, arising and perishing continuously. And according to our actions, then take rebirth in one of 6 general types of existence. And so of these types of existence, 2 are sort of heavenly realms. One is the human realm, one is the animal realm. We have the hungry ghost realm and also the hell realms. And according to our actions then, and this is the law of cause and effect, the whole thing operates according to this principle. So making the most of this human rebirth is important because it's short and tenuous. So what's the point of accumulating a bunch of stuff when we're going to have to leave it behind pretty soon? In fact, that stuff can become an obstacle in our transition to the next state of rebirth, whatever that may be. And that calls us to really think about what is really important in life. And another tenet is the idea of no self, that our self-identity is insubstantial. This I that we are so attached to is itself impermanent. It's been changing since the moment we were born, and we can't even get a good grasp on it, much less in future lifetimes. We have no idea what form we might take. So I'm just throwing this out because this is the traditional worldview. So, and it's important for trying to draw the connections between consumerism and the natural environment. There's a strong connection. Now, where I work, where I go in the summers, is up in the Himalayas, an area called Zanskar. It's about an hour's flight or 3 days by road from Delhi. And then you turn left and travel for a few more days over very bumpy roads. And you'll reach an area called Zanskar, which is almost untouched. But a road is going through, so if you want to see the real deal, I suggest that you go quickly. There's a lot of wildlife there. The air is so pure. The water is so pure. Lots of sentient beings hanging out there. They have these amazing marmots, and it's incredible. It's very sparsely populated. They get 1 crop of barley with just a 3-month growing season. So it's a very fragile ecosystem that has to be protected carefully. No one is allowed to come from another village to stay in the village without permission of the village elders, because even 1 stone or 1 branch of a tree could tip the balance, and they're very much aware of this. So when I tried to send some nuns to study in another village, I had to get permission from the village elders, because they would be drinking water that was the property of the community. So I'm very careful with all of this. When I first went to the area about 1991, there were huge glaciers. And this was an ice river, really dramatic ice river as you approach the valley. In the last 25 years, I'm very sorry to say that these have been melting. The glaciers have been melting at a rapid clip, and you can see the degradation that is happening as we speak. There was a project to create glaciers. One Ladakhi perfected a technique for building glaciers. But when the funding ran out, he had to give up the project, which is tragic, actually. So these also create havoc for the local people. Normally they're snowed in for 8 months of the year anyway, but they can get out by trekking over the ice river. But with global warming now, and I will use that term, they can't be sure that the river will be solid enough to travel out. So it's really disrupting the way of life of the people. And getting through on the roads is treacherous as these glaciers melt. So the people have preserved a form of Buddhist practice from the 8th century at least. And it's still alive and well. They're very proud of it. It comes from the Tibetan tantric tradition, and it actually keeps the earth in the center. And the center is called Mount Meru, and then you have 4 continents around, one of which is the southern continent. That's where we live, which looks suspiciously like India. So, yeah. And they are in touch with, their surroundings in an everyday way. For example, when they cross a pass, and their passes are up to 17,000 feet, they will place a stone on a pyre to give thanks to the local deities. Even though they're Buddhists, they also respect the deities of the place, what they call sadak, the owners of the earth. And they respect them before you build a house, before you take water, before you do a retreat. You always must take permission and make peace with the owners of the land. So they also are in intimate relationships with the animal world. Here's a yak. And the yaks normally live at above 14,000 feet. So sometimes they try to bring them down to 8,000 feet so the tourists can take a photo opportunity. But the yaks, they don't do well. They die, actually. So they like being up in the cold. And this is the Pin Valley in Spiti. It's another Himalayan region. In this next photo of a yak, I'm not sure whether you can see it. There are also some orbs that nobody knows exactly what they are, but they show up in these pictures. Some think that they are invisible beings. So the Buddhist cosmos includes a lot more than human beings and animals. It also includes unseen beings. So I'm not sure whether you can see it, but they show up in digital photos only, not on film. And the idea is that we also need to be aware that our environment is filled with many unseen beings as well. And we also need to send them loving kindness and be concerned about them. For example, as a Buddhist nun, I have a precept not to chop trees. Why? Well, because there are many living beings in that tree, and it is also home to invisible beings. So, yeah, to this very day, the Buddhists would honor these beings as well. The very first precept in the Buddhist view is not to harm any living being, and they take it quite seriously, up to and including protecting the habitat of living beings. They don't have a creation story. The world is without beginning. The Buddha looked back and he couldn't find a beginning, so the world is beginningless. But they do have a strong concept of stewardship of the earth because it's necessary for the welfare of sentient beings. Speaking of sentient beings, I have this thing with polar bears. And so when we look at the polar bears and their habitat, I mean, they're just so sweet. How can you not love them? And their habitat is being seriously degraded. And originally they were hanging out and having a good time. But gradually now, as the temperatures rise, and I mean they're really rising in India now, what's 48 in Fahrenheit? It's something like over 110, isn't it? Yeah, I mean the temperatures are rising to unimaginable. People were complaining about our little heat wave here, but it's nothing compared to what people in South Asia and the Sahara and the equatorial regions are experiencing. And it has incredible consequences for human well-being, especially water, but also hygiene and, of course, crops on which human beings depend. So now, with climate change, global warming, the poor polar bears are often getting stranded, and it's getting really, really serious. So if you read the numbers on the stats on the polar bears, it's really getting catastrophic. So this shows the interdependence between our consumer habits and the exploitation of the earth. So here, the Buddhists would ask us to take responsibility for our part in all of this. You know, how long is our morning shower? What are we, drinking out of? What are we buying? what are we eating? It's easy enough to talk about climate change in the etheric, but let's get realistic. Reality check. What is our part in all of this? And so making changes in our lifestyle. And people are still carting out huge packages of bottled water. How can that be in the 21st century with what we're facing? I mean, there's some blind spots, and we have to attend to these. The connections between consumerism and exploitation of the Earth's resources is one connection. The Buddhists have this theory of interdependent arising. So paticca samuppada. Because of this, this arises. Because of that, this arises. We're all interrelated, similar to the Native American view of all my relations, all my relations, all my relations. Drawing the connections between consumerism and social inequalities. So talking about the rise in temperatures, does anybody care that thousands of people are dropping dead in the streets of India? Even bringing it home to San Diego, does anyone care about food injustice? I think we have to care. Drawing the connections between consumerism and crime. All of the images that the corporate media sells us, tries to sell us, have impressions on our mind stream, and we need to pay attention to what we're being sold, what they're telling us we need to have in order to be happy. And so drawing the connections between consumerism and relationships, human relationships, and I mean relationship problems. A lot of it's about money, isn't it? Right? The problems among people. So that's part of it as well. In other words, the commodification of human beings and other animals. And we're talking, that all of these environmental problems also have social dimensions, up to and including trafficking in human beings, right? Why is it so easy to buy a 3-year-old in Cambodia? Well, there's nothing to eat over there. All the trees were chopped down by the government and sold to Japan. Almost all, no exaggeration. So these things are also very much interrelated. The Buddhists point out the importance of looking seriously at the idea of chasing sense pleasures, the whole shop till you drop idea, and thinking, being lulled to sleep like fools by the corporate media, corporate capitalism, living mechanical lives for a few pieces of paper at the end of the week, right? And this is what we get. This is our reward for wasting a week of our life. And then we get to go to the mall to make, kind of feel better about having wasted all that time. Okay, so then what's really important at the time of death? Because a lot of the things that we accumulate, in fact, are going to be not only useless, but may also be obstacles to our transition at the moment of death, and whatever comes after that. And we can all fill in the blanks there as we wish. Even in this life, to sleep well at night and die without regret, thinking at least we've not harmed someone in that day, or we've done our best, can we say, not to harm. So that would mean uprooting the causes of all of this, which are said to be, from a Buddhist perspective, greed, hatred, and ignorance. And the antidote is to train the mind and purify the mind of all of these contaminants. They call them mental defilements, or His Holiness Dalai Lama has been calling them the destructive emotions. So they train in learning to understand the mind and to tame all of our passions, our continual grasping after sense pleasures, gotta have our coffee, right? And learning to be able to be in control of where the mind goes. So this is the Buddhist solution. The more we have, the more problems we have. I have friends right here in La Jolla who have security systems that are so thick, it's like living in prison, right? Like, what? Gee, nobody ever tried to steal my car. who would want it? Which some may sound arrogant, forgive me, but really nobody wants something unless it's of value. And so by having things of value, we more or less set ourselves up for risk, at risk of theft. Obviously, it's an equation. So there have been some projects then to try to implement environmental policies into Buddhist monasteries. And here's one, the 17th Karmapa, who the rebirth of my abbot, actually, now is trying to introduce environmental policies in the monasteries under his sort of order. And it's going quite well, because luckily, because of impermanence, we can all change, we can all learn, we can all transform our minds, we can transform our lives, and that's very, very good news. So, simplifying it, simplifying our lives, simplifying our lifestyles, learning to generate compassion. May all beings be free from suffering, which is also a meditation practice in the Buddhist traditions, all of them. And loving kindness. May all beings be happy. So they actually actively meditate on these thoughts, sending out good thoughts to the universe, right? And the beings around us. George Carlin, the comedian, said, every 60 seconds, 30 acres of rainforest are destroyed in order to raise beef for fast food restaurants that sell it to people, giving them strokes and heart attacks, which raise medical costs and insurance rates, providing insurance companies with more money to invest in large corporations that branch out further into the third world so they can destroy more rainforests. There's a cycle, right? So recognizing the cycle. So here, to make all of us more uncomfortable, I raised the idea of recognizing our privilege. We've become very spoiled. Our living habits are evidence of it. Living in India for 15 years, the idea of running water was such a treat to find running water, forget hot water. But here we have not only running water, we have running hot water, we have our own rooms, we have our own showers. But the prosperity that we have enjoyed in this country since the 50s is built on sand, or shall we say oil, which causes all kinds of political and environmental problems. And so the remaining thing is to understand the value of generosity. Generosity is a prime Buddhist value. Basically means giving. So when there are so many needs in the world, how can we help? And in what ways? Helping in constructive ways that don't simply continue the development dilemma. So the Buddhists don't have a tithe like the Jews and the Christians. They don't have an obligatory 2.5% of giving of the surplus of our earnings. But they make it a point to try to be generous in whatever ways they can, giving water, giving food, giving shelter, and so on. So we might remember this with our homeless populations. Intention, the intention behind our actions, checking up. Why are we doing what we're doing? That's important also to recognize our self-interest, how our self-interest contaminates our decision-making, and trying to replace that with loving kindness and compassion and wisdom. So someone asked a Buddhist master, "What do you do?" And the master replied, "I pay attention." So I hope I didn't make you feel too uncomfortable, but I hope all of us can try to pay attention. Thank you very much. It's our future generation.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for two fascinating presentations. speaking of privilege, privilege could be a coin, of course, with two sides. We have been privileged in a positive way in listening and hearing two fascinating presentations. For now, I'd like to introduce Professor Aftab Jasal, who will be act as a discussant to basically compare and contrast and have a good discussion about the two presentations. Professor Jasal is an assistant professor of religion at Colgate University. He has received his PhD from Emory University, and he has actually also have taught at University of California, San Diego here in the religion program. So it's a special occasion for him to join us here. So can I please invite you here to? Thank you so much. Thank you. You could probably move there, and then I'll move the chairs.
All right. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Babak. Thank you, Professor Shordas, Professor Somo, for those wonderful talks. Thank you, Steve, Stephen Parrish, for all that he's done for bringing awareness to the field of religion and ecology here at UCSD. I remember being part of a really interesting conversation last year. So these are really interesting papers and really interesting presentations, very thought-provoking and insightful in the way they shed light on how religious traditions are engaging environmental challenges in the world today. And they show us how religious traditions provide really important resources through which to frame environmental problems and also address those environmental problems through symbols, through rituals, through cosmologies and various kinds of practices and institutions. These are all really important resources for different kinds of moral communities and traditions to understand, to first of all identify the problem as a religious one, as a moral and ethical problem, and then to find specific strategies through which to address that problem. So there's so much to talk about from both of you. I was listening to Professor Somo's presentation. I thought it'd be really interesting to think about the field of religion and ecology from a Buddhist perspective. What is religion and ecology? So you mentioned the Four Noble Truths, and I thought it might be a good way to think about how so the Four Noble Truths, where you're thinking of the nature of suffering. So in this case, what is the nature of the field of, what is the problem that the field of religion and ecology is addressing? What are the origins of this problem? Are we looking at one problem? Is climate change one issue, or is it a constellation of many different issues that require different kinds of strategies, different kinds of approaches? I found it fascinating, the comparison that Professor Shordas presented between this Navajo document on the one hand and this Catholic encyclical. There were important similarities between them, but also crucial differences. In the Navajo case, the ideas or the strategies that they were developing were in response to particular environmental problems. Professor Shordas said a lot, presented a very interesting comparison or that emphasized similarity between what the Catholic Church is doing and this Navajo document. I think it'll also be important to think about some of the differences as well. In fact, I think it might be a good idea for us to sit down over here and just have a conversation about some of the issues that were brought up. And, you know, and I'd like to also open it up to the audience to ask questions. I don't want to drone on about this on my own here. I just want to say a couple of things. So I want to start with a question for Professor Shordas. In your description of the Navajo document, which is against uranium mining, right? If I understood correctly, in the area?
It was using the Navajo's official opposition to uranium mining to challenge the Navajo tribes' tribal government's support of a coal-fired power plant.
I see. So in your description of that document, you used the phrase, or the document used the phrase, stewardship. Stewardship of the earth, or I don't remember the exact phrase. And I was struck by how interesting, I was struck by the fact that this is, it's an important similarity between the Catholic encyclical and this really fascinating document that you were talking about. Because you mentioned that the Navajos do not have a word for nature, so it is a non-anthropocentric cosmology. However, the idea of stewardship implies a kind of binary between nature and culture, or the human beings and nature. So what we see here is a really interesting example of a kind of theological creativity in response to a very particular environmental challenge. So it is a worldview. They are drawing on particular terms, concepts, cosmologies that are traditional, but then you see how those cosmologies are being transformed, or tradition is being reinvented in response. So I was struck by the creativity and the sort of the pragmatic nature of that kind of theological production. And I was wondering if you were struck by the use of stewardship, or what that might represent to you, and also about some of the differences between the Catholic encyclical, which is more general, it's not in response to a particular problem like coal-fired plants, and the Navajo, this form of religious environmentalism.
Mm-hmm. So I think, my thing is working here. I was actually struck by the use of the term stewardship in that document also, in a way that made me a little suspicious about where it was coming from. I'm not accustomed to seeing the term stewardship used in Navajo material. It's much more familiar as a Christian kind of and biblical sort of concept. And so my first response when I saw that is that, okay, so here's an author who's a very contemporary author, talking in terms of talking in terms of sustainability, using scientific ecological terms, and is he maybe also experiencing some bleed over from Christianity in adopting this term stewardship? You know, I worked very closely with a Navajo traditional chanter who I, for years, presumed was a kind of Navajo traditionalist, a sort of Navajo fundamentalist, until you know, years later when he started talking to me about going to high school in the Catholic school in Fort Defiance and getting married in the Catholic Church, and you know, there was that. I worked very closely with a Navajo Native American church Peyote roadman who used, you know, the traditional peyote ceremonies, which are not Navajo but are Native American from other tribes. And when I was talking about his background with him and his early life, found out that he had been an altar boy in a Catholic church when he was growing up. So these kinds of influences are there, and I'm just as willing to think that that's where it's coming from, as that's a, you know, he didn't use this term stewardship while invoking traditional Navajo ideas. He used the term stewardship. He also, in this document, referred to the distinction between nature and society, which is also, I think, a bleed over from more contemporary Western ways of thinking. And the guy, in fact, is a faculty member in the Navajo Community College, so he's got, you know, as a very contemporary kind of thing. You know, I would say that stewardship per se is, if it's used, it's probably used more analogously than it is in a Christian biblical sense, because of, in terms of the ceremonial obligation and responsibility for maintaining harmony and hojo in the universe, and you can get from one place to another, right, by stepping over for we're all obligated to maintain harmony. Okay, well, what does that match up with or map onto in the other tradition? Probably the idea of stewardship.
Right. So what I'm struck by over here is the strategic use of certain kinds of terminology and certain kinds of theologies in particular contexts, you know, for particular purposes, and that's, you know, a really fascinating phenomenon. So it's not the application of a traditional worldview, but it's the occasion for the production of a certain kind of religious environmentalist theology.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the biggest contrast in terms of the other part of your question is that Navajo spirituality contrasts most with the Catholic spirituality in the sense that they have no interest in or pretension to convert anyone else or to preach their religion to anyone else. But it's for them. And you know, I mentioned the Native American Church. Native American Church is a form of religion and spirituality that is pan-Indian. It spreads all across tribes, right? Navajo religion has never and never will do that. If you look in New Age spirituality, right, and you see, you know, the Native American shaman or healer who's going around doing ceremonies for middle-class white people, you know, that person is going to be a Plains Indian. He's going to be a Sioux, Lakota. He's never going to be a Navajo. Right? They just don't do that. Right? And so it's not just American Indian versus Christian. It's certain cultural orientation is within the many, you know, 450 or so Native American tribes will be more interested in proselytizing or spreading their form of view. And the Pope, in his encyclical, as much as he wants everyone to be a Catholic, is also reaching out to other traditions, and he's saying, you know, I want to say this for everybody, right? And now I want to say this for my fellow Christians, right? And other believers, you know. So he's trying to address different audiences because he thinks, as the Pope, he has the right and the obligation to talk to everybody, right? But at the same time, he knows he's got a particular group of people who will follow him.
I'm glad you brought up the Pope and the encyclical, because I was struck by the similarities actually between the way you were addressing the issue of the environmental challenges that the world is facing through the lens of interdependence, and the way the Pope was thinking about the connection between psychological, economic, environmental problems. You know, all of these are sort of part and parcel of a single, issue, or they're deeply interconnected. And I think that was something that was clear in your approach as well. I wanted to ask you about really the monastery, the head of the monastery, who's now thinking about trying to create a sustainable monastery and so on. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how these people are drawing on Buddhist tradition to affect particular kinds of changes in their communities. What are the examples that you could point to where interdependence or ideas around karma or and so on are being put into practice?
Okay, I guess this is time. Well, it's part of a revisioning, in a sense, of Buddhism, because we need to remember that all religions are in a process of change, and they have been from the very beginning. And like Native Americans, the Buddhists are trying to hold on to tradition, and at the same time, they're trying to make their traditions relevant in the modern world. So they're looking for ways to connect with what is important to people today. There's no point in being a fossil that no one's interested in. So environment is one of those ways. And some of the traditions, I remember when the Buddhists down in Sri Lanka were calling it the greening of Buddhism, and they were laughing. Suddenly Buddhism is also environmentally friendly. But at the same time, it's meaningful because this is the current crisis, and the Buddhists want to be right there to help with whatever crisis is up for people. So in this case, the 17th Karmapa is young. He's the one who was recognized in Tibet and escaped to India when he was 17. And it was a miracle that he got out. But he was recognized in Tibet, trained in Tibet, and then left for India, where he came under the protection of the Dalai Lama and the Indian government, which is very important because they provide security for him, because you can imagine Beijing wasn't too happy about this. He has a vision, I guess, in dialogue with Western people. Not sure exactly what his major influences have been, but he's come out a human rights activist, women's rights activist, an animal rights activist, and a vegetarian, which most Tibetans are not, right? Because the environment there was so harsh. You could barely till the soil in most places, and they didn't eat a lot of meat, but when it came, when a yak fell off a cliff, that was dinner. So somehow he has a kind of vision for making the most of the teachings that are already in place in Buddhism about protection of the natural environment for the benefit of sentient beings. For example, sustainable agriculture. So whereas the early Buddhists did not till the land, the monastics did not, the lay people did, that was their task. But the monks and nuns wouldn't do that because you might harm an insect or a worm, right? So you can see in the film 7 Years in Tibet, there's a very touching scene there where the laborer is building a new house, very gingerly save the life of some worms. But when Buddhism went to China, they had to till the land. There was no tradition of alms, going for alms around, so they started to grow vegetables. And he is following sort of that model to grow. I mean, the vegetables come from days away. They come from the Punjab. I'm not sure how many vitamins they have left. They're treated with all kinds of chemicals. I mean, last time I checked, DDT was still legal in India. And so to grow your own vegetables just makes perfect sense. Also to protect your water sources. The Buddhists in general have a kind of reverence or awe for springs and sources of water. They believe that Nagas live there. They're kind of like dragon-type beings, and you don't mess with them. When I got bitten by a snake in India, the locals say, well, that's the result of a Naga. She offended the Nagas by giving education to women. Oh my. So that was my crime.
Nagadosha.
Yeah, Nagadosha, exactly. So also hygiene, because in India, generally the forest was a natural place to go. But nowadays it doesn't work anymore because of the population increase. So trying to implement new concepts of hygiene, even bacteria theory. Now you could say, oh, this is destroying the culture because suddenly you've got people washing their hands all the time. But it's a happy meeting, actually, because if they don't wash their hands, then I almost lost in that in January because of, they call stomach infection. It's a bacterial infection, yeah? And so sometimes it's good. It's not necessarily a diminishing of the tradition. It could even be an enhancing of the tradition to look at new knowledge and how it can be incorporated positively, healthfully in traditional cultures. Yeah.
It's fascinating, and it shows the ways in which all of these different religious traditions are grappling with these issues in their own particular way, and so there isn't a sort of one-size-fits-all approach or a kind of religious approach to environmental change. These are very context-specific responses. I'd like to now open up the conversation to questions to both, and perhaps we'll take a couple of questions and then we can just respond, or maybe we can go one by one. In fact, either way. So let's just go one by one first. You pass the mic around.
Yeah. Thank you both. Thank you both for a set of compelling talks. I have a question that's particularly aimed for Professor Shortash, though. If there is to be some sort of effective religious response to a global problem, one imagines it might be a global form of collaboration, various different modes of religion, and we've seen moments of that in the Pope's encyclical. But for there to be such reaching out, there has to be a way of translating and understanding what's put forward. And the other thing, too, is that for the religions under discussion, their form of authority is moral, but that presumes that they have some sort of suasion that they can go and elicit a response. and the gap between what might be sort of a theological imperative and what's actually practiced on the ground could sometimes be vast. So one way of sort of thinking through whether or not there is some way of having a interreligious dialogue, or at least a communal religious meeting of minds, and also how close or far the gap between sort of theological imperatives and quotidian practice might be, is to take advantage of the fact that there's a strong tradition of enculturation in the Catholic Church, and ask, how is the Navajo Catholic Church responding to ecological problems? Are they working with more indigenous-minded activists, or are they perhaps aligning themselves with other powers?
So I think what's interesting, actually, is that Steve and I, along with some colleagues at Cambridge University in England, had recently been trying to organize a project on a fairly, on a large enough comparative scale to be able to pose the same question that you're answering, or that you're asking. And I think in order to answer the question, how can people talk across, if it can be established first that different religious traditions have an environmental, ecological interest, and translate across concepts like sustainability or stewardship, if that can be established, step one, then it can be asked, step two, how then can they join their voices together? And then step three, how can that make a difference? We haven't yet gotten very far with that, but I think it's necessary to pose the question on that scale and in that kind of progressive, stepwise way, in order to begin to address it. So, by which I'm saying I'm begging off addressing it in greater detail than that.
I don't think I need the microphone. I think people can probably hear me. I wanted to follow up on John because thank you all for this, right? And I get a real sense of how diagnostic and healing symbols and understandings are kind of gravitating towards places in the world that are wounded, to use a metaphor, right? And we have this sense of a world in crisis, and I see a process by which the world religions are, in motion, and they're aligning themselves with each other in ways that would be truly valuable to understand. And then there's another actor, there's another player here, and that's science. So I was wondering whether I could get you to comment a little bit on the relationship of religion and science. And Tom sort of took that up in terms of the encyclical, right? And I'm a little unsure about the relationship of the Navajo to science. And perhaps you could speak to Buddhism's evolving relationship with science, if any, as part of this healing process, I suppose I would term it.
Well, Buddhism has a very active dialogue with science for the last 25 years, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been the ringleader. Whatever the question is, he'll turn it to Buddhism and science. So he's particularly interested in issues of neuroethics, neuroscience, but the gamut. And in his view, if science can give us evidence that something is wrong, that the Buddhists have misinterpreted something, then he would go with the science. And sometimes the example of the fertilized ovum and being the moment of conception, when in fact it cannot be a viable fetus until it embeds in the wall of the uterus. Well, you've got 48 hours there. to make a decision. And if science can show that conclusively, then the Buddhist would have to accept it. This is his view, which is a very radical view. And yet, the principles, the basic sort of working principles of cause and effect are quite similar between science and Buddhism, and the whole valuing of critical inquiry. The Buddhists, you don't have to believe anything until you've verified it through your own experience, including meditation and meditative experience. So I think they're quite compatible, and most Buddhists, I think, agree.
Well, just in terms of the particular documents that I was looking at, the Navajo document, I think the college professor would recognize science as helpful to determine the issue of harm. You talked about substances that do harm. What counts as harm? I think he would recognize that. The tenor of the rest of it, in terms of invoking the traditional Navajo knowledge, feels more to me like something you might call political theology. The Pope's embrace of science is very explicit. The thing that I mentioned that struck me is that there's no science cited in the footnotes, right? But it's clear that he's very influenced by science and respects it and takes it seriously.
One in the back.
Yeah, there was one farther back.
I have a comment/question. I think I'm good without the mic. It's more environmentally friendly. Slightly long-winded, but I'll try to be short. So I think both case studies that were presented here already indicate the dominance of a global scientific language to understanding the challenge of climate change, and how certain religious traditions are now borrowing concepts, vocabularies, or perhaps bringing their own concepts and vocabularies to understand how this challenge works. But I think one major, if climate change is an injustice, one major aspect of this injustice comes from the universalizing language in which it is expressed. And this is the point that people like Carl and Bruno Latour have made, that when we spoke of the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution, it is almost self-evident that the credit for all of this goes to the industrialized West. But when we speak of climate change, this is now somehow a global problem that everyone is equally responsible for. And even an economist like Stiglitz writes that in 2007, the US banned shrimp imports from Thailand because the nets that they were using were not turtle friendly. And he points out to the hypocrisy of countries, of industrialized countries, that are contributing most widely to this problem, then pontificating on others that, well, you're going to sign the protocol, but we are not going to sign that. So I think even surrendering to science, unless we're assuming that science has this neutral language without any philosophical presuppositions, that might actually be tarnishing the local resources that we can use from these religious traditions to address a problem, instead of bringing out more evidence. So it's just a comment, and I wanted to know what you thought about it.
Well, when you say the resources that we can use, who is the we?
I think spokespersons from those religious traditions, like the Dalai Lama, perhaps, or people who can speak for indigenous people who can speak from those traditions.
It's important. It's important to define the we, and whether the indigenous traditions are speaking themselves or whether someone is presuming to speak for them. That's one thing. It's also important to make sure that there is the possibility of translating across all the different traditions. And in that respect, we are faced with the challenge of, what languages can we use other than sciences? What lingua franca do we have other than English that can allow us to make those translations? And also in terms of the effects of global climate change, we have to, I think, distinguish between asking the question, who's responsible for this, and who is affected by it. Because in the latter sense, absolutely it's the case that everyone is affected by it. When you say who's responsible for it, then it becomes, complicated, and even more complicated, and you get the issue that, well, anybody that's producing pollution is responsible for it, and you get the counter argument to that is that, well, Europe and the West have been polluting for a lot longer, and so we in the so-called South or developing world or third world, depending on which of those idioms you find least offensive, we should be allowed to pollute for the same length of time that the West did, and then we'll be on an equal footing. And that kind of runs up against the challenge of, yeah, but everybody's being affected by it right now. So it's a very complex question that you raise.
I think it's also a very important one, because I do agree that certainly human beings don't need to capitulate to science in every case, because in many cases, religion's role can be very positive in bringing in the ethical dimension of decision making. And also, for example, in the understanding of consciousness in these two ways. In terms of, science is created by human beings. The science is designed by human beings. It's interpreted by human beings. And therefore it's fallible. The potential for fallibility is built into the system, and therefore, and the utilization is also in the hands of human beings, who may or may not have the welfare of the whole of humanity in mind. And in fact, as we see, often it's the corporate interests instead of the moral dimension. And so also in the case of consciousness, the understanding of consciousness, neurophysicists are the first ones to admit they haven't the slightest clue what consciousness is, and therefore that's why they're very open to this kind of dialogue with Buddhists and other traditions. So I think it actually, it's a very fruitful dialogue, and we can get away from those hierarchies of authority, and just have an open conversation. It's better.
And definitely there's room to discuss different forms of science and how different scientific traditions have either contributed to the kind of a dark colonial industrial history that you refer to, and also different sciences who also probably compete or try to contain that history. Let's go with the next question. Thank you so much. Let's go with the next question. Yes,
just very briefly, I find this discussion about religion and Catholicism from Navajo and the Buddhist in relation to science fascinating. So I think there's more to be said about this. I'll be brief. One particular thing that I'm interested in is precisely how the climate change discourse shapes these traditions, right? And I'm interested in precisely because it's not just simply a neutral discourse. It has, what's called accounting of this involves issues of power and truth, right? There's a discourse of power and truth operated in this climate science discourse. So, as Jordash mentioned at some point, that the hope is, cooperating with scientists here at Scripps. So I'm interested in precisely how exactly the Catholic Church sees this climate science and sees as an ally, a strategic ally, in order to account for the Catholic doctrine or not. And you mentioned discussion on Buddhism.
as far as the Pope goes, I think he does regard these climate scientists as allies. My sense of the Catholic Church specifically doesn't have any quarrel with science. This goes back to the Catholic theologian and archaeologist Teilhard de Chardin, who, when he was examining the fossils of Peking man, came with the absolute conclusion that says this is really, really old, right? And there's no way we can dispute evolution. So, you have certain branches of Christianity that are very much opposed to science in a fundamentalist way, and you have certain branches that embrace science. And at least officially, the Catholic Church embraces science. There may be certain aspects where they, don't see eye to eye, but in general, I'd say they do.
I may just add, I think it's a really important point, Tom, to distinguish between official religious responses and localized, small-scale, so-called marginal, responses from these sort of marginal traditions, or responses by private citizens, small communities, sort of temple committees, as we find in South Asia. It's not the Dalai Lama or the Pope spearheading that initiative. They are spearheading certain kinds of initiatives, but that's not the only way that religion is involved with climate change. Sometimes it can be these very small efforts and very targeted efforts for a particular kind of problem. So the glacier issue, yes, it can be addressed in different ways, but the way that a community, a monastic community, might see that as actually a religious issue, it might frame it as a religious issue and then address it in a particular way. It would be very different from the kind of official, response that a religion would have to that. So the many different kinds of religions involved. It's not just these global religions or very highly literate theologians who are intervening in these debates, and all over Latin America, Asia, Africa, and so on. You have communities who are drawing on different kinds of resources, and it's not necessarily theological. These are ritual practices. These are very different kinds of institutions and networks that they're drawing on. So I think it's, I'm really happy that you brought that up.
Well, yes, I think it's a good reminder that no religion is monolithic. We have many different traditions within traditions, and the Buddhists similarly, they're just as different as night and day, from Sri Lanka to Korea, and Russia to Indonesia. And so the Dalai Lama doesn't speak for all Buddhists. He speaks only, for maybe certain members of his own tradition, the Tibetan tradition, and not everyone has the command of English to research these issues. People on the ground are facing a lot of economic constraints, the kinds of lack of resources that limit their decision making about the use of resources and how they interact with the environment. Also, if feeding your children means cutting down trees, it's a tough one. So I think it's good to remember all of the different views, and also the tension between, I think in most religious traditions, between contemplation and social action. Different people approach their own traditions in different ways, through ritual, through devotion, through contemplation, through social action. The Buddhist view, I mean, there are many who would argue for getting involved in the world is just a trap. We need more enlightened beings, therefore we need to, those who can, who are so motivated, should focus on spiritual practice. The world needs enlightened beings who can then go out and teach people how to get over their greed and attachment and try to rectify some of the problems. But without that kind of experience, inner experience, then we're not qualified. We're in no position to really be of maximum benefit. So you have this tension within the Catholic tradition and Buddhist traditions, but also in Islam and the Hindu tradition as well. So it's complex, complicated. Eh?
The note that everything is complex. We now have to end today's event. I really thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming and discussing. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I really appreciate it. And thank you for also for your questions. And hopefully we'll see you in the next event that is coming up on November 16th. So thank you.